Hello, everyone. President Sunday here. I am joined once again by Professor Clifford Bates in Poland. And I think we are discussing James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, but since I've barely managed to do the required readings for today, I think it's going to be a little bit more all over the place. But I did manage to read a tiny bit of the introduction, so hopefully that gets us some ways before we start taking questions from the audience. So good evening, Professor Bates. How are you doing today?
Alive. Well, a busy day teaching.
Are you still in lockdown now?
Yeah. Well, no. We're no longer really in lockdown. They're kind of let us out and moving about. We can do things, but school's not open. They're not reopening schools yet. They're going to reopen school in a couple of weeks. They will open up normal schools for the kids to go take the high school students go back to Matura. But the universities haven't. Most places aren't open. In fact, the option is most parents students don't have to go back. If the parents don't want the students to go back, they don't have to go back. So therefore, a lot of the programs decided if they were going to do it, they just might continue. But it depends on the program. Our faculty did everything online, so there's no point changing. Going back for 2 or 3 days, is kind of pointless. And we're still going to be required by the university to do any big test or final exam on digital platforms. I have 3 more sessions left, and I have 1 more session left in one class, and 3 more in another class. And then the other group, we have 2 more, and the other 2 ones, this week ends the track of the course, but then we are for the same group. I'm scheduled to have 2 more sessions with them because the system was not perfectly fit. So we had 2 extra classes, and therefore they said, okay, everyone just gets 2 extra classes. The last group they just get 2 extra classes for no reason. And you can do what you want because it's outside of it's because everything else was scheduled perfectly.
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, so I assume you're teaching a mixed class of English speakers and Polish speakers. How's that online?
No. Also, the whole program is most of these people are native Poles or a couple from the Russian East. We had a couple of students from Ukraine and a couple from former Russian Soviet states like Uzbekistan or something like that. One or two for Georgia out of that program in this class cohort. But most of them, but the whole course is in English. So it's okay. And you have to have, and to get into the program, they need to have English fluency. They have to be, everything is nothing. Okay, 1 or 2 classes, a teacher whose English is not competent will teach a class in Polish, but technically the program is all in English, and it's supposed to be in English. So except for 1 or 2 courses that are in Polish, because it's a program class we offer for the wider university, not for the students in our program. Do it this way, so it's like this. So
generally the university doesn't require English for all of their programs. It's this specific one.
No, in fact, usually we're with the English language the English program, Department of English. We're one of the few whole English language programs that doesn't require to pay money to get into them, because this is normal Polish state funded thing. So therefore, you don't have to pay extra money. There are other programs at the University of Warsaw and other state universities that have English language aspect towards this. But usually there you have to pay to take them, and therefore people who don't usually keep. Usually people, only those people who usually don't get accepted in the normal program go for those programs. So it's so ironically, the paying programs get more stupid. You get the people who couldn't get in, make the cut for the regular program. So you have people throwing money away, and therefore I always hated paying programs that pay often had very poor quality students in them. That was always, or what happened with people who would want to have nighttime. But most paying programs usually work in the evening and during the week, so it never really was really kind of a weekend program. I only know one program that's a paying program with a private school in the center that is legitimately a weekend program, because usually most of these paying programs are during the day, like anything else. Again, they targeted the students who just can't get in, or they target foreign students.
I'm going to remember that when I'm crying over my future PhD stipend. So we are talking about the managerial revolution today, as I mentioned in the intro, just to get right into it. So I only managed...
Burnham's book is written. Okay. I know you only managed to get a little bit done of it. I don't blame you, because it's a boring book. Honestly, it is a very difficult book, and actually, in many ways, it's one of these books that actually have to be read in light of a controversy in the Communist Party. The book is originally written out of a controversy that occurred in the height of the Communist Party by the 1940 publication by Bruno Rizzi in Italian, The Bureaucratization of the World. Okay. And people can read Rizzi's book at the Marxist.org website, because they have the whole book. They have it's one of the only it's only in HTML. It's not a PDF. It's not a book, but it's available on the Marxist.org website, and you can read the whole little book. And it's basically it's Rizzi, who's kind of sympathetic to Trotsky, is his critique of the Soviet state under Stalin as a violation of Marxist teaching, and therefore Burnham is at the height of his disillusionment, disillusionment with communism. This is like in 1938, 39, the Hitler-Stalin Pact 39, where the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which the communists make it go in bed with the Nazis.
Mm-hmm. What turned him off of? What turned him off?
Well, no, because of the what was going on. His reports, he was getting reports about what was going on in the Spanish Civil War. Mm. He didn't like the way the communists were fighting amongst themselves, and the infighting among the different groups of the left was counterproductive, and actually was one of the reasons why one could argue that Franco's forces and the forces of Franco and the forces of reaction won. Mm. I mean, Franco brought in the African troops from the Spanish colonies of North Africa, and armed with those large units of non-Spaniards, waged war on the various factions of the Republican South. Places like Barcelona, which was a very much progressive, still is a center of the progressive left in Spain, Spanish culture.
Hmm. So did he? Oh, sorry. Please keep going.
No, I mean, so Burnham was this, because remember, Burnham was basically a very much centered activist in the American Communist Party, American Socialist Workers Party. Mm-hmm. He was, in fact, he had principal contact with Trotsky all during the 30s. And was, in fact, Burnham, who was a professor, I think he was a professor at Columbia University in philosophy, and was getting, but he was a very much a socialite in that circle. And he'd be at a dinner party, and someone would call him saying it's Mr. Trotsky. The thing is saying, "Oh, there's a Mr. Trotsky wishing to talk to you, Mr. Burnham." And all of a sudden, all of the socialites at the party would so it's it's kind of if you read the biography about James Burnham, it's very amusing of the sort of
it's weird this guy's so obscure now.
Well, because he was what happened was that he became part of the hard anti-communist right. Burnham was one of the founders of National Review. He basically said, I mean, we have to remember, this is very funny. There's what's his name? I'm going to forget his name now. Social democrat, Sidney Hooks, very important social democrat, Sidney Hooks of the night, who was around the same time as this, a little bit older than Burnham. Brooks was a very much a social democrat all his life, never left it. Okay, but he was in favor of Joe McCarthy. Okay, because he was a social democrat who despised the communists. And we have to remember, a lot of American anti-communism emerged from not the right but the left. Okay, it emerged as out of a kind of, even things like the concepts of American exceptionalism, which we consider a neoconservative. We hear this as a right-wing ideal. American exceptionalism was really emerged out of a fight within the American left about why class struggle wasn't working in America like it worked in Europe, why you weren't going to get communism or socialism through class revolution as you did in Europe. And the argument was that there was something exceptional about the American cultural historical situation that would not allow for the same class warfare trajectory to produce the revolution as it did in Europe to have it occur in the United States.
Are you able to can you elaborate sort of like who the different let's say factions were in this disagreement within the left? Because this is really interesting.
Well, I mean, it was the fight between the Trotskyites and the old hardcores, the hardcore, more pro-communist, and or the ones of the communist state who kind of played the party line, kept to the official line of the Comintern. And this is within the what we call the socialist communism. There was an American socialist tradition from Norman Thomas before that was not necessarily that directly influenced by, but they saw themselves as kind of fellow, leaning and sympathetic to this. And then there were the progressives who would agree with much of what the socialists argued, but thought the socialists were fools, that this was never going to happen. That there was the progressives always believed elites were going to rule things, and therefore the only way you could reform society or modernize society is by controlling the elite. That's like people like you look at Thurston Valen as a perfect example of this. Thurston, the progressive mindset, Veblen, Veblen, Thurston Valen, his theory of the leisure class, his famous economist / student of society. Thurston Veblen's theory of the leisure class. He wrote lots of books about things about against imperialism, against war. In fact, his understanding of evolution as and consumer culture was actually very feminist. Okay, he got their head of thing. His argument was that people weren't, in other words, the people weren't people were not really acting out of economic self-interest, but rather acting out of their own sense of status seeking. And therefore people consume in order to show status, not to really benefit themselves, but rather people are irrational status seekers. And actually would pursue status at the expense of what is their actual utility. So Veblen, therefore, this is and people like Veblen, people like not necessarily Dewey became a later John Dewey became a later thing of the progressive, but he like Beard, the famous historian Charles Beard, in his critique of the Constitution. Also, the front. Even though I like aspects of the thing, the famous book about the closing of the frontier. What was it? The author's name. What is the?
Is it
Turner.
Yeah.
The Turner thesis. The closing of it is very much, again, a part of this American progressive thing, which was not Marxist. Therefore, we have this American progressive tradition emerging out of people like Weber, Veblen, Thurston Valen, the behaviorist tradition in the political science, people like Charles Merriam or Harold Laswell. And the sociology by what's his name? I mentioned a couple one or two things ago when I talked about.
I actually have your section here highlighted. Maybe I can find it really quickly.
Well, no, but what's so interesting about this
Merriam?
Is that what?
Merriam or Dahl?
No. No. It's the other guy. I know. It's he's the sociologist, very famous, the Chicago sociologist who translated the Weber the first time. I mentioned him when I talking about the first translation of Weber.
Yeah. Oh shoot. Yeah. Okay.
I have so much thing in my mind. My mind gets kind of cluttered, and I forget names. It will come to me in a minute or so after I talk about something else.
Oh, Talcott Parsons.
Parsons. Parsons is again the Chicago school shapes. This is what shapes progressivism. Now, the so-called the Trotskyites and these guys are basically immigrants, mostly immigrants. These are mostly Jewish immigrants. Let's be honest. In the New York City areas and Jersey, New York, New Jersey communities of the industries and activities, they attended the City College, which was the City College of New York was one of the things that the New School things like the New School and the City College were creatures of the progressives. And what happened was the young Marxists and the young Trotskyites went there. And this is where in the 20s, in the teens, in the 20s and 30s, this became the rise of these young intellectual Trotskyites, which then in the late 1930s, just before the war, produced people like Daniel Bell, who's can say the cultural contradictions of capitalism, to people like Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz. Who would become the so-called neoconservatives, right? You have the so-called the School of New York intellectuals. Now, Burnham therefore it's very problematic because first, Burnham is not a Jew. He is he's not wealthy, but he comes from a very acceptable middle class family. He's an academic philosopher, at Columbia. At the time, the 1920s and 30s, and he is sympathetic, I think, in many ways, sympathetic to the critique of capitalism and justice that the radicals are offering. But his, there's a thing, Bismarck said about engaging in politics. It's like people who actually this is why some of the biggest cynics in the church are the people who get involved, who are the workers or the people active in the church. Anyone who sees the sausage being made can't eat it or have no stomach for it. Okay, that's the problem. And I think what happened was Burnham was very close to the policy making of Trotsky and the Trotsky circle, that he got disenchanted in this thing of it, and it got to the point where he was responding to the behavioral revolution is responding to the critique of Rizzi of what was going on in the critique of what happened in the Soviet Union, how the concept of the new class.
Yeah.
If anyone who studied, if you anything studied about Soviet thing, the creation of the so-called new class, how after the communist revolution, instead of eliminating class structures, what happened was instead of the workers taking charge, the dictatorship of the proletariat was not really controlled by the proletariat, but by the nomenklatura. Okay, this new class who became the class control, and the nomenklatura, who were mostly petty bourgeoisie and elements of the old aristocratic class, or the illegitimate children, or the offshoots of the old aristocratic class, or the petty bourgeoisie, who they were not workers. Okay, like Lenin himself, he wasn't really necessarily a worker, and that that this new revolutionary cadre of that the Bolsheviks brought in, of the leadership of the hardcore, emphasizes creating a new class of leaders that would control the party, that would then control the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat was not going to be really controlled by the people per se, but rather controlled by the new class, the apparatchiks of the nomenklatura, who would shape the party. Now, this is and Brizzi's account of this, how bureaucratization was going to was taking hold even in Soviet. You couldn't escape it. So this was a kind of merging of Robert Michael's argument of the fact that any democratic institution, if largely organized, and attempting to organize any large thing, would essentially become bureaucratic. This is the Michel's Mosca hypothesis that any large scale, or no matter how democratic you think it is or want to be, it will eventually become oligarchic, and therefore the nature of the nature of in other words, effectiveness needs. In other words, there's a diminishing marginal return on the size of a body and its effectiveness. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that any large organization is going to have a cadre of representative agents, or either directly elected or appointed, or simply just emerge and appoint themselves, who will run things on behalf of everyone else.
So please continue.
And that's what this is what Burnham is kind of arguing, that there is going to be the nature of all organization. Now, you have to also understand at the same time in business theory. In business theory, you have the rise of Taylorism, which is very important to understand, because it's the rise of I always want to say Taylorism, but I want to get the name right.
No, please take your time.
Frederick Taylor. He was a proponent of scientific management theory. He died early 1915, but Taylor was an argument for the concept of the rational application of management of labor. And his model of rationalism, although he dies in 1915, his kind of thinking of it shapes modern industrialization. It shapes the character of the modern 20th century corporation. And it became the managerial model of it's basically the bureaucratic organizational hierarchical model, where the people at the lowest level are kind of don't have to be smart; they just have to be functioning soldierism. They just have to do the people who are working at the bottom only have to basically do specific functions and not have to think about work. In other words, use division of labor to divide up the workforce, to reduce it to its most menial and most efficient element, and then just simply have every worker and every part of the process just do that. This so-called assembly line. This is why, that's why Alex Huxley calls it Fordism, not Taylorism. Now, there's a big controversy to what degree does Ford really and other industrialists were rationally copying Taylor's ideas, or was it just this kind of that Taylor caught on to? Taylor didn't necessarily create something; he just saw the logical consequences of large-scale production, and that's how it was going to work, and kind of gave it an intellectual idea. And then at the same time, people who were engaged in this would come across it on their own. Now, Taylorism and this management model was embraced by both Lenin and Stalin. So therefore, this is an irony here, that enemies of the capitalist system embraces the managerial model of the capitalist system. And this is what Burnham is kind of talking about here. Burnham is talking about that the future, in other words, that in large-scale mass societies, given the scale and the structure of them, the organizational structure is always going to be controlled by a group of people, somebody, and therefore we've gone from so therefore human history has gone from the time of the great aristocrats to the great businessmen. Now we're going to the realm of managers. Okay. If the time of kings, the time of aristocrats, the aristocratic period, then with the demise of the French Revolution, the rise of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, and that became the impetus for capitalism and the rise of the classes, the capital classes. And then and now as the modern corporation has moved, instead of it being, yes, you would have people like J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller, but the idea of the single capital entrepreneur being the shaker was going to be a thing of the past, because what was going to replace that was not going to be the great captains of industry, but rather what was going to replace this was the rise of scientific culture and the rise of scientific managerialism. Therefore, the managers were going to take over. And now Burnham did not live long. Remember, he's writing this in the 1940s. He doesn't see the things that will come. He doesn't see the rise of computer technology. He doesn't see the rise of telecommunications revolution that happened in the 1970s and 80s, and the rise of telecommuting. He doesn't see that exponential expanded when time comes for the internet. Okay, when in the 1990s. And then it doesn't even see the next stage when we go from laptops to cell phones. All of a sudden everyone has a smartphone. That even democratizes it even more. Okay, it spreads out the structure. Now and now with the nature of the technology allows for processing of information at levels that were unthinkable even then. And also things of information control that the communists and the NKVD would just have dreamed about, like today's Facebook and Google has the ability to unperson people to a degree that the NKVD would love to have had. So Burnham's point about this was that it was basically that the old liberal order was dead, and it was dead because of the structure of the realities of economy, that the realities of economic system led to the rise of the managerial class. And this managerial class was not a friend of democracy. He would be he could be a friend of either the Bolsheviks, or he could be a friend of the fascists or Nazis. He's not, or he could be co-opted. He could be co-opted by the liberal Democrats as well. The liberal Democrats, like New Deal, tried to co-opt that. And in fact, that's what, in many ways, we could argue the progressives was the progressive movement of the 1910s, 1920s was the intellectual attempt to kind of co-opt power of the managerial model for the sake of democratic purposes. That's what you can say. People like Dahl, the whole Dahl movement of behavioralism and the movement for polyarchy, defending, pluralistic models and trying to defend pluralistic systems in the name of democratic principles.
Yeah.
Okay. Dahl's famous 1950s book, Who Really Rules? I forget. It's about it was his book about who really ruled. Who Rules? The book was called, but it was basically about who really rules New Haven. Okay, he wrote a book about who is the real owners of power in New Haven, and it basically was an elite argument for elite theory plus democratic pluralism. So, in many ways, what we have to look at this in light of this. Now, the problem with this is that Burnham also, because he was just tied with the McCarthyists and that stuff, and tied with the right. Remember that he wrote regularly for the National Review. He was a diehard anti-Soviet.
Yeah.
He lived. Reagan gave him the Medal of Freedom. So even though he started out a man of the left, but then he didn't join. The problem with the neocons didn't like him because he wasn't one of them.
Right.
In fact, he was more hardcore anti-communist and less willing to accept the New Deal. Like once he saw the light of the thing, he then rejected even the New Deal. You understand? In other words, once he saw the light of the managerial, the threat that the managerial model. Now, he wasn't a libertarian in that sense. He was cynical. He thought the libertarians were kind of childish and understanding. That's why, in many ways, and he wrote a famous book on Congress, echoing the argument that people like Wilmer Kendall were making in the 50s and 60s as well, about the American tradition as a congressional system. In fact, that's to defend Congress is to spit at Wilson. Yeah. Woodrow Wilson, as a political scientist, wrote a book about the congressional government, and that wasn't a compliment. He argued that the Constitution.
Please. No, keep going, please.
What?
Oh no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I didn't want to interrupt that train of thought. I just had a quick question about the neoconservatives related to Burnham, but please finish that thought first.
No, I mean about Wilson was the big critic. He was a progressive. He was a political scientist professor. He wrote. He hated the congressional system. He wanted America to have a parliamentary system. But then once he became president, he modified his view. He wanted Congress. He wanted a presidentialist system where the Congress only was a rubber stamp of things. In other words, the legislative would no longer. He did not want the Congress to control everything. He was an enemy of Congress and congressional control. He thought the reason why America was screwed up was because of the power of Congress. Kendall opposed that. Kendall and actually Burnham also, in Burnham's book on Congress, would champion Congress as the constitutional approach as the only way to preserve. Now, this is funny because we would think of Congress. We today think of Congress. We think of Nancy Pelosi and that joke of a thing that's in the House, right? But the problem with that is that Congress has abandoned its responsibility. Congress, for the past 40 years, has kind of surrendered itself to the courts, gave all its power to the courts, and let the courts legislate. Did two things: surrendered, empowered the bureaucracy to actually allowing the bureaucracy to legislate a lot, and then at the same time allow the court. So therefore, by letting and also transferring things to actually something the progressive institutions like the Federal Reserve, the 1916 Federal Reserve Act. Again, this was progressive. The idea that you don't want Congress controlling financial decisions. You want the experts doing it. You want people who understand this controlling these things. So therefore, you have all the progressive institutions, and Congress slowly started to let's have more of these. these nonpartisan entity bodies do our job for us. And therefore we can't get blamed. It's the bureaucracy. No. The court did it. We didn't do it. No. So therefore, what happened was it changed the nature of Congress. So if Burnham was alive today, I think he would be arguing that what's wrong with Congress has not to do with Congress per se, but how the founders understand it, but the derailment of what the founders wanted Congress to do. In other words, if the founders wanted Congress to be a truly deliberative body representing the communities, our current Congress is way too small. We would have to. I mean, the founding fathers wanted the Congress to be one representative for 30 to 40,000 people, even 50,000 people.
Yeah.
So imagine that. Imagine how big a system of Congress would be. It would be just you couldn't fit them in the House chamber. That's how big it would be. So therefore, I think the best you'll get is 100,000. But even if you went to 1 per 100,000, it would be 5 times the size it's now. So, in other words, the representative body is much too small, and therefore, and therefore that's why it's oligarchy, because of the larger scale representation. Therefore, smaller factions or smaller pluralities ultimately controlling of selection of who gets into to be the representative, and the fact that there's so few of them, and the system is so dispersed, any member of Congress can play a very important role for controlling and withholding legislation. So therefore, the nature, in other words, it has become more oligarchic. In other words, the Congress has increasingly become really a quasi-oligarchic managerial product of the fact of the growth.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So as conceived by the founding fathers, it's supposed to have a federal character to it, as it's quite literally like a federation, not simply. People also think of Congress as quote unquote the government, when it's supposed to be something to which, at least at the level of an individual community, they have a direct line into as sort of how they deliver.
Yes, that was supposed to be but that was destroyed. The congressional representation of communities was destroyed when the Supreme Court in the 1960s and something like Baker versus Carr, which aimed at state legislatures, declared that the concept of one person, one vote under the 14th Amendment forced the redrawing of legislative districts. So, in other words, instead of legislative districts being defined by the natural existing organic communities, they now were defined by proportionate populations. And therefore, what ended up happening was that before most states were kind of evenly spread out between rural, in other words, state legislatures often had more representatives from the rural and suburban, rural parts of the state than urban parts, because of the reality of county lines and things like that. What the Baker versus Carr and other court decisions did about reapportionment all of a sudden gave overwhelming representation to the urban areas, and the rural areas became less important. That's why, if you ever look at how state spending worked, before 1960s, all of the state universities were always any state university or any major project before 1965, you would see them out in the countryside. It would be actually more out in the countryside than inside the big cities. But after 68, you rarely ever saw a large-scale spending or new programs being built in the country. They became urban-centered. Everything became urban-centered in the state legislatures. So therefore, in many ways, the courts changed both the character of the states and the character of the nation because of that. Because as the state legislature, so therefore that. And also you have to remember that before the before the Constitution changed in 1916 about the selection of the Senate, it used to be that the state legislatures elected the Senate. Now there's direct election for the Senate. which again changes the character. Therefore, the Senate used to be this branch where you'd have previous people who had a successful careers at either at the state level or as a congressman. The legislature would pick them to be the senator. And therefore, it was kind of, but then that was criticized as being, well, people don't have a chance to control that. But also, by surrendering the state legislature's control over the state legislature lost an input into the federal legislature. So therefore, that kind of lost that completely, and that senators just became basically, in many ways, a political placeholder for like a governor. See, in other words, a senator and a governor both have the same electorate. Okay, so therefore, and since governors were traditionally seen as someone who could get support from a state, right, and that's why they would be picked for presidential candidates, because they had the potential of bringing a state in and its votes into the thing. Therefore, senators now became seen as a viable a person to become a president. So therefore, that it changed the character. The way the Constitution was changed and the things like that. It changed the character of politics. It changed the character of the Senate and the House itself. It changed the character of the American framework. You have to remember that the same thing that as the same time that's happening, the state legislatures are redrawing districts, and that this will change the election. The state legislative, the federal districts will become changed, reflecting those changes within the states. And what ended up happening was that the Congress, and by 1970, in the 70s, the House elections became increasingly radical every 2 years. The Democratic electorate became even more radical and moved away from the more rural-based constituencies to more urban-based constituencies, and that changed the character of the House too. It became more Democratic. That led to the Revolution of 1974, where the congressmen, the House took over the thing and got rid of seniority, got rid of the committee chair people rule. It basically radicalized the House. That subcommittees, the subcommittees chairman became the real powers of the centers of power, and that dominated American politics until that shaped the Congress from 1974 to 1994 with the Republican Revolution. That changed, that kind of went back a little bit, but didn't really overturn it. And we've been in the Congress since '94. We've been under the same rule, even when controlled by Democrats. The Democrats never returned back to the 1974 model. It just kept the Republican model, where all the power is in the hands of the Speaker and the leaders. So therefore, again, that's good. But what does Burnham have to do with this? Well, this is the argument here is that the managers, handlers, institutional bodies, leadership, are going to be controlling the system more and more. Now, what Burnham didn't talk about was the nature of capitalism itself. Okay. Yeah. And actually, this is true, because I think this is if you take his argument and this apply it logically, what happened starting in the 1970s and 80s, the creation of mutual funds and pension plans and these things, as mutual funds and pension plans became the largest source of stock ownership by the mid 80s. By the 1990s and early thousands, they are 80% of all capital is controlled by them.
Before we get too far into that, I just had a quick question, because I'm kind of curious for some clarification of this myself. So obviously he rejects the various Marxist groups and organizations sort of contemporaneous to him based on sort of practical experience. And
he also despised the New Left. He despised the New Left, the 1960s New Left. He despised them. As most of the neoconservatives also despised them. They shared that in common. They looked at the New Left and looked at them as just and remember, the New Left is the boomer generation. Okay, right. These are the baby boomers. The Vietnam War protesters, the draft dodgers, the hippie movement, the yuppies. Okay, Burnham had nothing but contempt for them.
So did this attend? Did this was this attended by a contempt for Marx's writings himself, or what's his relationship there with?
I mean, he didn't really. He didn't have a contempt for Marx. He just thought Marx missed the point. He was never really a Marxist in that sense. In fact, he never was convinced by Marx. And actually, Marx is a bad economist. The Austrian economist von Bloch and his what's that guy's name? I always mispronounce his name. He wrote a very important, fantastic history of course, they don't list the names. I hate this. Eugene Bohm von Bavik. Bohm. It's a hyphen. Double barrel
I'm going to just put that in the chat so people can see it. Because I can't.
You have it?
Yeah, I do. I'm just putting in the chat so people can see it. Eugene von Bawerk?
Yeah.
Bawerk?
Yeah. And his book on Marx was devastating. It was his 1884 Capital and Capitalism. And then he wrote the chapter on the book is called Karl Marx and the Close of the System, 1898. It was this devastating critique by someone who understood it, and therefore that's why I think it's an interesting thing.
Okay, so actually, the last man has provided a pronunciation for it. It's apparently Bombaverk.
Bombaverk, that works. I never was able to pronounce. I still mispronounce names left and right because I don't see. You don't hear them. You don't hear the name. You don't.
Yeah.
If you don't hear the name regularly, you don't. It doesn't get into your thing. You only read them on the page. It's like
Well, especially when you're reading people who haven't been talked about in the mainstream for decades. It's like nobody.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
never had a common conversation.
I learned about this because of my libertarian. When I was in college, I met these libertarian Ayn Randians and some of these cliques of the people interested in von Mises, and they had a thing called a magazine called Liberty. No, not Liberty Fund. Liberty Fund is the thing, but they had a thing called Laissez-Faire Books.
Okay.
And they used to have a catalog. And you'd get these books. You go get a catalog, and actually that's how I ran into Laura Wilder. Laura Wilder. Little House on the Prairie. Author.
Oh, okay. You are talking about that. I was confused for a second. It's like I don't remember a political theorist named Laura Wilder.
No. Her daughter was a political theorist. In fact, is one of the leaders of the Libertarian Party. Libertarians. What was it? She actually probably.
That is bizarre.
Laura Wilder's the mother's books were really written by her daughter.
So that's the authorship controversy.
Rose Wilder Wayne, who was a notorious ghostwriter. She wrote famous books. People would write want a biography. They'd pay her to write the biography for them or the book for them. That's how she did it. She and Ayn Rand and Isabella Patterson, an African American woman, were the three archetypal ladies of the libertarian movement. Which today we don't, we think libertarian is a man game. No, in the 1930s and 40s, libertarianism was very much women. Rose Wilder Lane, Isabella Patterson, a black woman, who would be condemned today, and Ayn Rand, the Austrian people, von Mises despised Ayn Rand. Most of the clique around von Mises despised Ayn Rand as
she was pretty hostile towards big L libertarians as well, wasn't she?
It was a mutual hatred because and she had her own little cult of crazies,
Right.
And still do. The cult of the dollar. I know. And then ironically, she's as much a radical individual, even though in many ways she is better than her followers. She was hostile to religion. She despised things, but in many ways, her instincts about being a soldier and soldierly life, she was not. I mean, she might have been against the policy of the Vietnam War, but she was not hostile. Where many of her followers became part of the New Left.
Before I forget to mention this later on, just so it's on the stream and I'm reminded, you are an Aristotle scholar. I want to discuss Ayn Rand and Aristotle with you at some point.
Oh God, no, don't get me in trouble. No. My friend Doug Rasmussen, who's an outstanding Doug Rasmussen and Dennis. Okay, I can never say his name. Udell. It's a Dutch name. He's a research scholar. Dan Earl, DEN space URL. He's at Liberty Fund. He's a fellow at Liberty. These guys wrote fantastic books on Aristotle, a kind of defense of Aristotelian philosophy, and from a libertarian kind of point of view. And they were kind of, I think both of them also wrote kind of an attempt to kind of rehabilitate. They're not Randians, but they kind of defend Rand. Okay. But there's a very interesting book I remember reading when I was in college called Objectivism and Ayn Rand, critique of. There's a lot of problems with objectivism in the sense that it basically accepts the concept of the willing agent. And therefore, this is something that's not Aristotelian at all. This is, even though people say, "Oh, well, Aristotle talks about the will," no, a lot of modern philosophers in the 18th and 19th century adapted the language of with the will into Aristotle's works, and therefore the idea is there's this whole literature of the doctrine of the will in Aristotle's Ethics and things like that, which are, if you read the Greek, saying, where is the will? Where is the will is a holy, the will is a product of two things: one of Christianity and Augustine, and second of the Augustine Neoplatonic, not necessarily Augustine, but with Augustine and many of these Christian Platonists around the time of Augustine.
Am I?
And they're
no, please continue. Finish that thought. Oh, well, please.
No. But I'm saying the doctrine of the will emerges from Christianity, plus the modern philosophy is a secularization of Christianity, as Nietzsche and also many scholars argue. So therefore, modern philosophy took the concept of the will from the Christian fathers. And then used it as the basis for modern philosophy. In other words, they emancipated the will from God to man. Yeah, and man became the willing God.
Am I off base in not suggesting, but like people who I've read around Ayn Rand's time, there seems to be like a very strong like Ayn Rand's writing is very, she almost preaches to you. She doesn't really argue in the way that a political philosopher usually would. That seems like it's something endemic to that whole period of writing. You have a lot of these people who are sort of constructing these, you know what I'm saying? Like these really doctrinaire, strident treatises.
Yeah, but that was the style of treatises too. Remember, the treatise style was like that. But then there was other, you have to look at the libertarian. You have to look at many of the so-called, one of my favorite not libertarian, but the classical liberal authors of the period. William Graham Sumner.
Yeah.
His famous book, "What Social Classes Owe to Each Other." His answer is nothing. Okay. One of the famous essays in that book is "The Forgotten Man," which he argues that the forgotten man is not the peasant, not the poor person you want to give programs to. No, the forgotten man is the guy who is paying for those programs and not benefiting from those programs.
Yeah.
But back to
just very very quickly, just for the sake of my own bladder, do we want to take like a 5-minute intermission and then we can continue that thought and then go into audience questions? Because I see there's a few people here who wanted to ask you some things.
Yeah, we can do it. You have background music. You can do.
Sure.
You don't have a thing that
I can accommodate that. Hang on, but the problem is you'll have to be really quiet or we'll be hearing you echo.
Okay, I'll just turn off my mic. I mean.
There we go. Elevator music. I'll be right back. All right.
Okay, I have Sean McMahon has asked me when do I get back to the U.S. Am I echoing it? All right?
Oh no, you're good now.
I don't
you were
go
for a
back.
second, but you're good now.
I don't go back often. I tend to only go very rarely. Last time I was hospitalized critically. Last time I went back because of something with sodium. Listen, I almost had no sodium in my body, and I'm trying to avoid my medical bills because I have European insurance, and the European my insurance that I had from Europe wouldn't pay the American hospital bills. Someone joked about this. I should do a GoFundMe. I says, come on, GoFundMe. Get a whole bunch of money from money that I have to give to the damn hospital. Nah, I'll take the bankruptcy any day. No, my wife, after that experience, my wife refuses to go to the U.S. Again. So I probably won't go for at least 2 or 3 more years. There's no reason to go. I miss America. I love America. I miss it, but it's, I'm not going to go. I'm unemployable. I'm unemployable. I'm too old. I'm too right wing. I'm too white and male and heterosexual. So therefore, that's not going to be a thing of this. I live pretty well. I don't make a lot of money here, but I live pretty well here. I can afford my books and all. As long as I get, that Rasmus line. As long as I get money for my books, I'm happy.
That's me basically. I don't make a lot of money, but all I need is a steady supply of coffee and the ability to order books off Amazon, which has been flouted recently. I'm not happy about this now. I was enjoying the silence for a little bit.
About Amazon because I am such a it's very difficult to get things from U.S. Amazon here. I got one today. Somehow, some way, something came, and it came express. It cost $15-16 for a book, but in the box it came in was so huge. My wife said, "Oh, something must have come so light," and jumping by. It's one book, a box like 5 times the size. This is Tom Pangle's new book on Socrates' founding political philosophy and Xenophon, the Economist, the Symposium, and the Apology. So I had his book on Tom Pangle, who's at University of Texas Austin. He was at Toronto for so many years, but then he hit mandatory retirement. So before he was kicked out with mandatory retirement at the Canadian school, he took a full professor position at UT. And he brought his wife with him. His wife, who had trouble with her position at Canada, all of a sudden the UT said, "Okay, no, great, husband and wife team, great." And he hired many of his former students to get jobs who had problems getting jobs in Canadian system. All of a sudden, he had 4 or 5 positions to fill there, and he did. And he then hired Mario Virilli, the Italian scholar who got, because of the so-called plagiarism scandal that he got involved with his Pritet, the Republican guy, the analytical Republican guy, demanded he get kicked out of Princeton because Virilli used to spend as much time in Italy as he used to do he'd come for the fall in America and then go back to Italy for the spring. Okay. And he was doing this back and forth. And what happened was when he got into the scandal because of a book he wrote, apparently in Italian, but it was translated, he just took a lot of the modeling from Pretet's book on republicanism, because he just kind of used it was a very Italian way of doing things too. It's kind of plagiarism. That's all Italian scholarship from the 16th, 17th, and 16th, 17th centuries got to plagiarize. What is it? What it says? Mediocrity borrows, greatness steals. Someone said, a Renaissance author said, mediocrity is borrow, greatness steals. So therefore, really got in trouble. And then the other guy who was angry at this, demanded he be get out of not allowed to come back to Princeton, and it became toxic environment. So what happened was then hearing about this, Pangle had him come to UT, and then all of a sudden UT is the only school where the Cambridge School and the Straussians take courses from each other, which never happened any other time. So it's hilarious. You have this mingling of the two approaches. You have kind of neo-Thomists there at UT with you have the kind of Straussians under Pangle, but there was also some Straussians there before, but not as well known as Pangle. So Pangle's book was Pangle's writing books every year now, so it's fun to read.
But
now let's ask questions. What?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to start from the top if that's all right, because there have been some that have been waiting very patiently. So this one actually goes right back to Burnham. So the last man asked at 9:40 a.m. I'm so sorry. What did Burnham see in William F. Buckley that made him switch sides?
Oh, but that was way before that. Buckley. Burnham was already hardcore anti-communist in 41, 42, and by 46, he met Buckley in the mid-50s. Buckley, the person who made Buckley most of all was Wilmer Kendall. Kendall was at Yale. Kendall was he just came back from. Remember, you have to realize Yale was the feeder place of the CIA. It was the heart and soul of the CIA. And Kendall was very much coming back from his war experience in the OSS, already having a PhD in political science, political theory. Move from Richmond. I think not Richmond. I think it was University of Richmond. I forget what school he was in the South. He was at LSU for a while. Then he was at Richmond. Then he was at Yale hired him, and then that was the famous case where he and Yale hated each other. The professors at Yale, the political science people who wanted to be behavioralists, hated Kendall, And that became the Civil War. Now, it was under the tutelage of Kendall that this young Buckley emerges. So it was Buckley, whose father was an oil millionaire, very much an oil investor in Latin America. And therefore, young Buckley spent time in Latin America and other things like that. And therefore, since Kendall was a wonder kid at 15, learning languages. He knew Spanish and French at 14. He got his PhD. He was earning his PhD at 16 at the University of Illinois. In late 30s, he got a what do you call it, the Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford, where he then took a BA and then an MA at Oxford. And then he came back, switched from being a romance. He was a journalist. He wrote a book in the 30s called Baseball: How to Play It, and How to Watch It, under a different name. He was writing as a journalist. He went out to school in Oxford. He was going to Spain occasionally to follow the Civil War and writing as a journalist in that. Kendall comes back, during the World War II. The OSS hires him because he has the PhD in politics. He was at the founding of the CIA. It had the big fight with Sherman Kent about the difference between the way he lost that debate with Sherman Kent, but it was a very important defining debate about the way intelligence should operate. Kendall had a very hard critique of the failures of intelligence and the failures of this. And Kendall recruited Buckley to be at CIA. He didn't think Kendall didn't think Buckley an intellectual. Or maybe not. Sorry, he didn't think him a real philosopher or something who was serious about these things. He saw him as kind of maybe intellectual person, a warrior, someone who's going to fight the Cold War and win it. Okay. Buckley, however, being a man of his class and a style, he wrote a best-selling book at school after he graduated, God Man at Yale, which gave him the eyes of the young right at the time. And when he joined, he started the magazine National Review to kind of be a response to the New Republic and the Nation, which was the stand bearers of liberalism. Okay. So it's the idea that, and what happened was Kendall probably introduced Burnham to Buckley in that sense. So it's not that. So therefore, I wouldn't say that Buckley kind of converted Burnham. Rather, Buckley was a good cultivator. He knew when to cultivate talent, and he saw. In other words, he latched on to the skills of Kendall, but then saw Kendall was a very problematic person in many ways. He drank too much. He womanized. I mean, when he converted to Catholicism, he had to annul 3 marriages simultaneously. I mean, imagine having a papal. He was the only man in history to have 3 marriages simultaneously annulled.
Oh my God!
The Vatican. So you have to understand.
Okay, sorry. I'm not going to ask about that.
No, I wouldn't say that was. It's a more complicated situation. Yeah. Buckley's importance was that Buckley kind of saw the need to get rid of the kooks,
right? Like
the John Birchers.
Yeah.
It's not that the John Birchers are wrong; is it the way they were wrong, or the kind of they went too far? To say that Ike was, that famous line, that Ike's a communist. No, Ike was Ike was a product of Roosevelt. Roosevelt cultivated him, hoping he was going to be a Democrat. But the problem was Ike was really a Republican, okay? But he was a country club Republican, the typical kind of Kansas Midwest Republican. Of the country, of the business class, and of the not really kind of intellectual, and because he was a child of the bureaucracy and child of war, he was not going to be. He didn't really like the idea of operations. He was not really a good general. He was a manager only. But Ike was the perfect manager in that sense. And therefore he wasn't a communist. He was just a golfer. That's the famous response. Ike's not a communist. He's a golfer. The problem with therefore that's the style of Buckley's National Review was kind of tried to kind of push off the most extreme arguments of the old right. Okay. Now, the problem with this, by the 1980s, then they said what happened was, as the neoconservatives and other ones who were former liberals started to embrace aspects of equality. It started with the equality arguments in the 1970s. Was equality a conservative principle, or was it a principle of the left? Traditionally, the right always argued that it was a position of the left. But then certain elements among the right, libertarians, West Coast, Harry Jaffa and the West Coast Straussians, and fusionists all started saying, no, equality is the heart of what we believe in, and freedom, and therefore Jaffa's famous essay, "Equality as equality as a conservative principle," published in the volume of essays that Buckley put together. You ever see a dream walking? About conservative literature. This was published in like 1981, 82. So by the mid 80s, all of a sudden, what happened was Buckley started to champion kind of a right that would appease to the more center left. And therefore, they started to, by the 1990s, they started to marginalize people who talked about race or talked about ethnicity. That's why, or talked about, the old Catholicism that had problems about Jews, you couldn't talk that anymore. So therefore, people, old right Catholic rightists who had some hostility to Jews. That's why when I look at someone like what's his name, the Zoomer, what's his name? Nick Fuentes.
Oh yeah,
Nick Fuentes. He is nothing but a 1950s Catholic. He is a 1950s Catholic rightist. There's nothing postmodern about him. There's nothing alt-right really about him. He is the kind of right-wing Catholicism that you heard in America in the 1950s and up to the 1960s. Okay. Jews are looked at suspiciously because they have dual loyalty.
Right.
But ironically, that's the same charge people made about Catholics. Okay.
Yeah.
So therefore, there's a little bit of kind of blame them, not us. As a forgetfulness that the church and the church leadership was very much against school prayer. People forget about that. It was not only the ACLU leading the church, the cases against that, but Catholic dioceses and Catholic groups were forefront leading the court cases against school prayer in the 1950s and 60s, because school prayer in America meant Protestant prayer. Okay.
Right.
So therefore, you have to remember, the dominant culture in America was a Protestant culture, white Protestant culture, and the Catholics, we oppose that. Now that changes starting in the 1970s and 80s. Those kind of Catholic immigrants, those Catholic Democrats, became Reagan Republicans. Okay, and therefore, in order to appease them. In order to appease them, what happened was people like Buckley started to bring in many of these more neoconservative voices, and that changed the character of this. Now, what he says, did Mr. Bates, as Sean McManus says, Mr. Bates, did Buckley compare the civil rights movement to the Mama? Yeah, but that was because you have to remember, Buckley in the 50s said things that he in the 80s he did not believe, because you have to realize Buckley was a product of an elite class of New England. Remember, he was not WASP; he was Catholic, so he was a minority.
Yeah.
Though he was from wealthy family, he wasn't New England Brahmin. I'm more my father's side of the family are more New England Brahmin than he, but we're swamp Yankees, so we're the poor dumb idiots who didn't get rich and didn't control the elite institutions. But we were stupid and we stayed and we didn't move. We weren't smart to move to the West and get that big land. We were the poor the Yankees who stayed there and then see the Irish Catholics and the Italians Catholics take over everything. Okay, so Buckley. It is remembered. It's in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that the Catholics, both Irish and Italian, start taking over these urban political machines. Okay, and that changes the Democratic Party. So, and they also changed the Republican Party. And therefore, Buckley kind of came into as a conservative. Remember, conservatism was really tied more to the Democratic Party in the 1930s. I mean, there was two wings. There was, of course, New Deal Democrats, who were progressive, and was very much tied to the Rooseveltian position. And there were some Democrats who were kind of working class socialists. But the Southern Democrats were anti-progressive. And the Midwestern Democrats, again, were kind of like this. And many New England Democrats were free trade. Democratic free trade policy was the policy of the Democratic Party in the 19th century, where the Republican Party was a party of combination of isolation and also tariffs. So if you understand that kind of situation, it's a much more complicated thing. And Buckley basically kind of created a persona of him as this Brahmin intellectual. And therefore, he became the thing he personified. And what happened with this is that in order to fit, he socialized with these left-wingers.
Right.
He used to socialize with, what was that economist, the famous economist? The new elite theory guy, Galbraith. John Kenneth Galbraith. He used to go with Galbraith to Gstaad in Switzerland and ski every winter. Okay, he hung out with New York and literature. He was a literary person more than a real intellectual. He used to write detective novels and spy novels, right? Therefore, he hung out. What?
I remember, like, my first exposure, really, if I'm being honest, probably my only exposure to him was he actually moderated a debate between Peter Atkins and William Lane Craig. And I remember watching him. He had very much that sort of Christopher Hitchens sort of suaveness to him. Like he was very much.
That was kind of a character. There was the famous debate between in 1968 in front of the Democratic primaries, ABC, I think it was ABC News. He and Gord Vidal had that infamous fight where Gord Vidal called him a fascist and Buckley called him I can't use that word. You don't have to use that word. But
if you're quoting, it's okay.
Which was and let's go fight. It almost came to a fist fight between Buckley and Gord Vidal on television at the time.
Yeah.
So the Buckley of the 60s is not the Buckley of the 80s. The Buckley of the 80s is richer. He's smoked marijuana in the ocean and Atlantic High. He's become more kind of like free, open. We forget that. Everyone forgets that G. Gordon Liddy used to hang out with Timothy Gordon. The guy who gave drugs, Timothy Leary. We have to remember, Timothy Leary was part of the CIA LSD project. Okay, people forget that some of that crowd. Hitchens. Someone's saying about Hitchens.
Yeah.
Hitchens was British, and that Britishism gave him character from America. See, You come with a British accent to America, you're cool, man. Americans are superficial in this way. You get any a foreigner comes over, speaks with an accent. They sounds hell of a lot smarter than they really are. Hitchens was inconsistent. Hitchens was a con man who was a child of the left. He came to despise the Democrats. I mean, Chris Hitchens, when he saw the kind of double talk in he came to personally hate the Clintons. And out of the personal hatred of the Clintons, he kind of broke away from his knee-jerk, everyone on the right is a Nazi kind of thing that he had in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I never, Chris Hitchens was, I know a lot of the so-called people on the web like him as a free thinker, part of that. And, he was part of the New Atheists. Nothing the New Atheist wasn't said by Tom Paine or by any other a Spinoza-esque critique of Christianity hundreds of years ago. It's not like this. And in fact, this is so funny seeing, what's his name, Dawkins now saying, well, the world will be a worse place if Christianity totally disappears. It's like, no shit, Sherlock. But it's the likes of you that has led to a whole bunch of young people to see Christianity as this toxic thing of only for idiots.
Well, I mean, like on the one hand, I understand their motivation to push back against what's his name, like Ken Ham types and the like. But at the same time, they didn't differentiate between those and like the long history of very serious Christian thinkers that contributed to all of what they want to protect.
Well, that's why, because they engage in the same kind of cheap straw manning that they accuse others engaging in.
Yeah,
that's why and that's what I kind of don't like. Never really. I for a short time I kind of liked what was going on with what's his name? Come on! The psychologist
Sam Harris,
Peterson. I liked Peterson.
Okay.
No. Sam Harris, I despise.
He's not a psychologist. Yeah, I did. I was worried for a second.
He was a leftist. I agree with J.F. Therapy, who argues that Sam Harris is just a liberal moralist and always was. And always uses his nationalism as an attempt to impose leftist ideas on everyone else. I liked at one level what I saw, the kind of gut level, kind of emotional reaction to the PC culture that did it. But then once he started talking about his kind of, I do like Jung. I have some sympathy to the Jungian ideas against Freud, but you go to the Jungianism went on overdrive. He was basically doing what's the guy, a hero of a thousand faces. What's that famous?
Chris Campbell, or not? Is it Chris Campbell? John C. Campbell.
Joseph Campbell. He basically did Joseph Campbell on steroids.
Right.
Without really honestly mentioning Joseph Campbell. That's what's kind of putting me off. And then when I read his book, it was his big book. I didn't want to buy it. I finally bought his big book, and I was just so horrified by it. It was such a jarbled gobbledygook.
This is Maps of Meaning, or
Maps of Meaning, or whatever. It was just such an. I was looking for this great critique of Soviet ideology mixed, but it was like they were just rambling ideas. No wonder why Harvard didn't keep them.
Yeah, I get. Yeah, Peterson seems like I like his emotionality because it marks him as someone who at the very least is sincere, but at the same time, like his treatment of whatever philosophical topic he's touching on is so dilettantish and just kind of like, oh, here's some family resemblances between these things, and then just treating that as if it's like some contiguous trajectory of significance, and it's just so sloppy, and like it's creative a little bit, but it's not telling you anything true.
Yeah, two things I want to respond. Logos, Locke's Logos. You're right. Paine did despise atheists, and I think you're correct on that. He thought that they went too far. They made claims they couldn't. But the problem was, ironically, it's so funny that Hutchins tried to defend his critique of Christianity by appealing to pain rather than modifying his critique. So that was always odd about that. I see someone up there, last man to ask, did I ever read Jung? I read shitload. Yes, Jung can be crazy. The red books. But Jung is a lot saner than Freud. And Jung had a deeper understanding of myth than Freud did. I think that was good. But the problem with Jung, you're right, Jung was basically second-rate Nietzsche. Come on. No, Freud and Jung are just second-rate Nietzsche. They just used the idea, the concepts or insights of Nietzsche and just kind of operationalized them in this new discipline. Remember, it was with Nietzsche and also with people like William James. Remember, William James called himself not a philosopher but a psychologist. So, the rise of, like, even Kierkegaard was considered a psychologist. So, in the late 19th century, once the concept of the will came up, and that philosophy was about the will, post-Kantian, post-Hegelian philosophy. And therefore, the new attempts to understanding the human mind and the human will, that philosophy became psychology. And therefore, Nietzsche is considered like the high point of radicalization of this philosophy of the will and as the basis of the intellect, and that therefore people like Freud and then later Jung just take this and bring a scientific veneer to it. But I see. Any other questions?
I'm just so I think we're coming close to an hour and a half. So let's say, how many questions do you feel comfortable taking at this point?
Okay, whatever. Let's do it.
Whatever. Okay, sure. So guys, chat, please ask questions, and we'll try and get to all of you, I suppose. We'll say like about 15 or so more minutes because I have to get going myself. But yeah, chat, ask questions.
How good is Samuel Bennis's development of Burnham's idea from The Last Man? I think Sam Francis wrote a lot of books about Francis probably has done more to help rehabilitate Burnham than anyone else out there in that sense. The next person is the guy who, what's his name? The guy who created. The other person, the recent person who did a lot to rehabilitate Burnham is not Michael Anton. Michael Anton, although he mentioned it, it was the other guy. What is the other guy who at the so-called American Interest or American? What is the magazine called? American
Perspectives? No.
No. The American Interest, I think it's called.
Okay.
Let me see. No, it's not that. God, I just had a magazine. I'm going to go look at.
Here we go. It's the American Interest.
No, that's a different thing. I think American Affairs.
Okay.
American Affairs, it's called. Let me see this about. Let's see if I can get the editor's name. Come on. Yeah, Julius Crean and Gladys, the deputy editor, Gladden Papin. Now, people like J.J. Reno and Michael Lind, who's famous for Michael Lind's new book about the new class, right? The new elites, the book on the elites. He's an editor of it. So Yoram Harzoni and the idea of David Goldman, who I know is a journalist. He's his pen name at Asian Times is, I think, come on, what is the guy who wrote The Decline of the West? Spengler.
Spengler. Yeah.
His pen name, Gordon's pen name for a lot of things in the early thousands was he was under the pen name of Spengler for magazines and online journals. And David Goldman is a very intelligent guy, a journalist, proponent up there. But Lind is there. But this is Klein and Papin, along with Anton, created the Journal of American Greatness, that little blog in 2016. That became where Anton kind of did his Odysseus, his character, and then but then all of a sudden it got popped. It was a kind of joke among them originally. It wasn't. They were serious about it, but they were kind of like they were having fun doing it, talking that no one else, thinking that only a few people would ever look at this online. But then it caught on because it started to get cross-posting. People like me and other people started posting on Facebook among our Facebook friends, and then some other my friends who are more important than I am started to repost it. And then next thing we knew, that all of a sudden it was being talked about. They got scared because all of them were working for mutual funds. Two of them were working for mutual funds, and if Wall Street found out they were writing this kind of about Trump, they would have gotten fired. Okay, so they took it down immediately and hoped they'd gone away. But then by taking it down, it actually made it even more popular because people like some of my friends who kind of copied things, they kept it, they ghost mirrored it, and then they started reposting it. Then I talked with Julie Ponzi and a couple people and suggested why don't they put the Journal of American Greatness together. The new Journal of American Greatness came down because I wasn't involved in that, but I was cheerleading the idea of going do it, and they went and did it. They went and did it. They got funding for it. Julie is one of the editors. And then what happened was Anton came out when he published the article in the Claremont Review. The Flight 93 race that became thing. Now remember, again, this is now all of a sudden Anton's fame because of Flight 93 led people like Julius to get courage to create this magazine, the National Affairs. And Julius is one of the biggest rehabilitators of Burnham. In fact, there's a couple articles on American Affairs. They are really trying to advance a policy-based idea, understanding the Burnham's critique of managerial capitalism and the need for trade policy to counter it. Therefore, that's where, in that sense, no. So Sam Francis is important because he kept things alive in the 90s and thousands. I wish to God some of Sam Francis' books were republished. Yes, I also have to thank people like, what's his name? Paul Gottfried, God bless him, running now the editor at Chronicles. Chronicles Mag. I used to read Chronicles in the 90s. That was the place where all the paleocons went to after they got kicked off National Review in the 1990s. This was the so-called paleocon was Thomas Fleming and the Rockford Institute. All of a sudden, they had the fight where they threw out the Rockford Institute got rid of First Things, the First Things magazine. They had a fight between the paleocons and neocons, and the Rockford Institute kicked the First Things people out of their offices, and First Thing separated from the Rockford Institute, and they became their own neoconservative. And now it verged on
Richard John Newhouse.
Pastor Newhouse. Yeah, he was a Lutheran who became a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
Newhouse had a very weird moment in the 1990s where they wrote an article because he was a neocon, but they wrote in First Things they had a thing called the End of Democracy issue, where they talked about how the court was destroying democracy and we come to a moment where democracy is at its end. And in that issue, Bork wrote a piece for it, screaming with it. It was one of Bork's pieces. But then all of a sudden, the Jewish neocons went ballistic about it. All like Gertrude Himmelfarb and other neocons resigned from First Things, and it became a scandal because they argue that Newhouse went too far, saying this is like Nazi, saying that Clinton's thing is like Nazi Germany. Oh my God, it cannot nothing like Nazi Germany. So how dare he say that about this? This is not, this is not the same, and there's kind of this vibe. Ironically, in many ways, the position of the neoconservatives were then attacking Newhouse, who was one of them. He was a neocon. But many of the Newhouse crowd who were like this, all of a sudden it became really a Jewish versus Christian debate in that sense. And a lot of Christian conservatives kind of like afraid to alienate. Oh, we can't be called anti-Semitic. So they walked away, and that debate ended in a weird way. Now, there's a very good collection of those essays, and it's called Newhouse published a book. It's called The End of Democracy. It's worth reading. It was a big, important debate in the middle of 1996, 1998, I think, around that time. That was a very important element of of this issue. But again, like I joked before earlier, anyone who thinks Nick Fuentes is a alt-righter or this kind of something new phenomenon. No, he's not. He's a paleocon. Can
I actually ask you a question about that? So I'm struggling to sort of figure out how all these different subgroups in the contemporary right sort of fit together. What would you say is the relationship between, if there is one, or what is the key breakaway between the alt-right, what we call the alt-right today, and all of these old things that are sort of in the common vernacular associated with the alt-right?
It's the alt-right was basically a combination of internet culture with this kind of culture of kind of snarkiness. It was a snark. It is kind of like the internet. It's an attitude. It was an attitude plus also and the way internet discussion worked,
right, and
the way anonymity worked in the internet world. Plus some of the idea, the right was always the right wing was always far more diverse and divergent in his character than the left was, the American left particularly. The American left, although there was like much of the American left was still very progressive, and it played. Even though the mainstream left did not like the radical left, it tended not to attack it as much. Now, this is not true. I mean, you got to argue that you have to realize communism did scare the liberals.
Yeah.
So therefore, liberals were more anti-communist. We have to remember, McCarthyism was created by. Not Joe McCarthy, but it was created by Harry Truman when he made all civil servants sign a loyalty oath. Okay, in 46, 47. It was Truman and the liberal anti-communists within Truman's administration that began the Cold War. It was the liberal Democrats and the trade unions, the AFL-CIO, went to the Republicans and said, "Hey, don't go isolationist." They went to Van Buren. They went to two key American Air Force general and a leading thing and say, "Reject Taft. Rejects Taft's position of return to isolationism. Make a deal that the foreign policy will not be a divide on domestic on political partisan politics. The creation of the so-called, the Cold War foreign policy consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats on war. Now that died after JFK died. That died when how Kennedy ran Vietnam policy. Nixon was stupid to continue and defending the Kennedy, the Kennedy/Johnson strategy for fighting the communists. It was, this idea that John F. Kennedy would have only if John F. Kennedy lived, the Vietnam would have ended. It was just raving crap. He made Vietnam the mess that it was, and Johnson just lied to everyone about it. Okay, if Nixon had any balls, he would have exposed it all to the American people and blamed the Democrats for it, and saying all those boys who died because of JFK and LBJ. And it would have been a different thing. But Nixon believed in the presidency, believed in the institutional. Now this is the funny part. This is when you have calls like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. talking about the imperial presidency at the time of Nixon, right? Nixon is not doing nothing different than FDR did. Yeah. Nothing. Watergate was SOP of every democratic governing machine in America from the 1930s on. That was SOP. You don't think Roosevelt used the FBI to spy on his opponents? I mean, you look at the 1944 election reel, where the Democratic National Party basically portrays Wilkie as a Nazi. Okay, yeah. You have to just realize that this idea that God. Nixon did was so outrageous. No, that was, Nixon did everything the same way Democrats did. The reason why Democrats got mad is that it was a Republican doing it, not them. Okay, that's the hypocrisy of this thing. If Nixon was more courageous and he was not a moderate, and actually the same thing with Goldwater. If LBJ did not LBJ, if JFK did not get killed, a Goldwater JFK election, Goldwater might have won. That was the fear. Some conspiracy think that the Democrats bumped off Kennedy knowing that he was going to die anyways, and that since he was dying from his medical conditions, that he might as well die a hero, and therefore we'd have a martyr. They were hoping some right-wing Clinton. No, what the story was when they told Jackie that it was a communist who killed her husband, not a king. Because they thought originally they thought it was a Klan member, the KKK or some Klan member was going to shoot him. In many ways, I think in many ways, doing the car in the open in Texas at that moment was kind of like, come shoot me, please. Some Klanman, come, take a pot shot at me. Yeah. But and she goes, her remark was, it's a dirty communist killing Jack. That is a lost opportunity. That was that famous line that what Jackie said. So this is what one of Jackie used. Jackie used the the bloody skirt. It was optical control, trying to make her husband into a modern saint, and this became the new myth that shaped American politics. But again, this is Nixon was too stupid to. Nixon he could have fed the American people Vietnam and put it on the cult of Kennedy. Kennedy made this mess by destabilizing Vietnam. Kennedy emphasized assassinations and needlessly undid all of the success of the Eisenhower years of our relationship with the Russians. By his weakness and his insecurity led the Russians to go on a very extreme countermeasure that was actually helping them get success in the developing world. Before Kennedy came into power in 1960, the communists the Russians backed down. Although they had some success after 56 but they started to Nixon's offensive, the kitchen debate, and those other things, and the American thing just forced them to change their position. And what Kennedy did by pay any price, bear any burden, knowing that he was going to cuck out the second anything really came to shove. Remember that his inaugural address: pay any price, bear any burden, as long as it's paid by people other than Americans. So look at Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
Why using third-party people? This idea, JFK did not know about Bay of Pigs. Bullshit. He was involved and knew things with it. He was always a champion of special operations. It was under his presidency that he favored special operations and special operation things, like the creation of special forces, the Green Berets, and special operation units that would cooperate with things like the CIA more directly. So I mean, the myth of Kennedy versus the reality of Kennedy that was so exposed by the Pentagon Papers, that would have been such a lovely that instead Nixon and Republicans get the blame for Vietnam. This is the sad, silly tale of this thing. Reagan, but again, this Burnham saw this. Burnham criticized this. Burnham really despised Kennedy for what he was, because Kennedy's anti-communism was not a real anti-communism, because it was a sham anti-communism. Remember, Kennedy was the guy who created the concept of the missile gap as a campaign wedge in order to put Nixon on the defensive in the 1960 election. That the Eisenhower administration and Nixon was responsible for missile gap. There was no missile gap. That was a blatant lie. But Kennedy ran to the right of Nixon in those issues, and he was a hawk. He was aggressive, and what ended up happening was we had an irresponsible foreign policy that minute Khrushchev saw him in Vienna, said, this guy he's a pastry puff. That's why the joke, even in a famous speech in Berlin, I am a Berliner, right? Well, that's the term Berliner in Germany is a big pastry puff. Okay, and therefore, when he said that, it was absolutely true, because this is what Khrushchev saw him in Vienna the first time, saying he's a pastry piece. He's a nice fluffy thing with hollow cream inside. He will say something, but when push comes to shove, he was hollow. And everything he did always confirmed this. Even Cuban Missile Crisis, in many ways.
I unfortunately have to wrap up for myself because I have an appointment. Okay. But before I do, Dilvani actually asked a rather interesting question, so maybe we can finish with that one if you're all right with that. And Professor Bates, I was just going to suggest, after we wrap up here, if you're not familiar with StreamYard, I think you should actually, first of all, I want you to promote your channel here before we go. But secondly, you should host these, because I think there'd be a lot of interest in just asking you questions.
I know that too, but I'm always. My wife is. See, my wife knew I was doing this. She'd be furious. She says, "You shouldn't be doing this in our bedroom," because this is the bedroom. She makes me go in the other room, but because she's working today, she's doing her. She has her web seminars for business, and therefore she has her clients there making her money for the month. And therefore, she doesn't know this, and I'm going to catch hell. Like, you did what? I made sure the camera doesn't see our bed. You don't see anything like this. I'm so close to it so that you're getting me like this. So I should. You're right, but I'm just such a. I always tried doing this, and then I tried doing some videos recently, and I end up killing them because it just I was doing a series of videos. I did it, and then I looked at them. And I said, "No, they're crap." I'm too critical in that sense. So that's it.
No. Look. Just literally do what we're doing now. And what you can do even is just invite people to sort of come on over time. I'd be happy to occasionally. I'm sure a lot of people would. Hell, invite the academic agent on. I'd watch it. Yeah.
Oh, but no.
I think he owes you by now. I think you because you came onto my channel and we saved his book. I was going to do a point for point.
Oh, I mean, I'm still waiting for the damn publisher to give me a damn copy of the official copy of the book. I can't write my review and get my.
Give you...
I can see it's not kosher to get the book from the author. Okay, that's a no-no. Okay, and therefore I'm supposed to wait until the official copy, even though the official copy would be crap and unreadable. I still want the cover of the official copy so I can go write my review. I know what I'm going to say. It's going to be praise. Basically, it's going to be positive about it, but I'm going to have some criticisms of it. My own channel is so pathetically small, and I'm not I should do more.
Hey, it took me almost like 5 months to get to 200 views, and right now or not 200 views, sorry, 200 subs, and right now I'm getting there. I'm almost at 1,000. I'm counting every individual one. It's like, yes, more. But I wouldn't despair of that necessarily. But as to that last question, we should finally get to Dilvani the Goddess. What do you think about promoting traditional non-alt-right ideas in this alt-right fashion of Nick Fuentes, etc.?
I have no. See, but problem with Fuentes is, I mean, my problem with Fuentes is he's too young and he should actually go to school. He should finish school. Yeah, but he was destroyed. His experience at BU destroyed him, and I think, and then the left targeting him as he did, left him no choice. He was, I mean, in many ways, it made him what he is now. The left, and the vicious way they deperson people and they destroy opportunities. Yeah. Nick Fuentes, if Nick Fuentes was more of a hypocrite and just kissed up to the conservative ink types back when he started, it was only because he said something about, he gave us at a youth organization, he was honest about immigration. And, the how do I say, the nice third worlders that the conservatives bring in as their face people heard that, and they, he's not kosher. And they asked him about Jewish. They asked him, and then he said, how about going to Israel? And he goes, why would I want to go to Israel for? I mean, I believe in helping America. I'm an American. I'm not Jewish. Why should I go to Israel for? What is the purpose of this? Mm-hmm. And they kept on twisting on him. And I think this is what, he became, and then he got, like his generation, they like snarky humor and like this. And then what happened was the hypocrisy of Shapiro's a clown. I've never liked Shapiro. My Polish friend, a little older than me, who's a civil servant, likes Ben Shapiro. You should be great. I said, Shapiro is a joke. He is not serious. Why the hell didn't Shapiro have a job? His only job is being a pontiff. He's a controlled entity whose only thing done in life is being an opinion maker. What the hell has he done? Has he got a law degree? Okay, does he practice law? Not really. He writes books about what? About ideas. He's an intellectual. Intellectuals are the greatest evil of mankind. This idea that ideas have capital is kind of like, ideas are ideas. Yes, they may be good, but make real things. That's why many of the so-called intellectual right despise Donald Trump, because he's a guy who made money. Yeah. Okay. He knows how to market. Okay. He's better at marketing than they are. I mean, come on. Look at the idea of American greatness, right? Make America great again. Bill Kristol, and the whole old would it be the magazine that collapsed, the Weekly Standard, which I used to like, but even then they went too far. In the 1990s, against Bush and the second Bush, they argued for the idea of they were promoting what's his name. The Arizona guy, the Vietnam POW guy, McCain. Thank you. McCain in 2000 against W. Bush, and promising a vision of a national greatness agenda. Okay, it was, and many of the issues Trump blabbed on were issues and themes that they talked about in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And but he marketed them better, and he understood how the voters would appeal to it. Where their appeal just fell on deaf ears, his appeal was better. So they despise that. But,
and isn't it beautiful? Oh, sorry.
But back to your question about traditionalism. Traditionalism has a problem, and I this is where I kind of sympathize with Fuentes in a way. About it's very difficult to buy traditionalism when it's being advocated by 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and young women, his anti-e-girl thing is actually, I think, is correct, even though he goes too far and kind of mocking it. But in many ways, he's right that is problematic, because when you have these e-girl celebrities and things like this trying to put these ideas, it's hypocritical. It doesn't work. How do you really champion? That's the problem with a lot of this. A lot of the problem with conservatism. Conservative believes, oh my God, we got to get minorities and women as our face people so we can show that we're just like them. And that's that's not conservatism. That becomes a kind of
it's not traditional.
Liberalism light. It becomes a liberalism light, which is.
It's quintessentially not traditionalist. I guess it could arguably be conservative. I don't necessarily see a contradiction between a sort of an abstract conservative stance versus a. Traditional by definition, you're specifically invoking a state of affairs in which that kind of thing wasn't possible, for better or worse, whatever you think of that.
But also traditions change. This is the problem: is traditions never stay the same. Traditions, and even traditionalism, has to adapt to the reality of the changing of tradition. So therefore, traditionalism is not as kind of static or permanent as the other. Always changing.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, that's why you have to talk. That's why there's that very good Slavic guy. What's his name? I forget it. He wrote a very good book on defensive tradition. He was a theologian.
No, not Zizek.
What?
Not Zizek. No.
He was a Lutheran theologian who became an Orthodox. He was a professor, I think, at Yale, a religious professor at Yale. It was a famous book. He wrote the book about Mary, Jesus through the centuries. Jesus Through the Centuries, one of the famous books he wrote. Yaroslav Pelikan.
Okay.
Pelikan wrote a book on defensive tradition that was outstanding in the 1980s. And I think it was if I can find it, I think to get the name. Vindication, I think it was called Vindication of Tradition. It was his 1983 Jefferson lecture. He got the Jefferson Award.
Yeah.
They called it Vindication of Tradition.
Yeah.
And he was a Lutheran, I think Croatian, Serbian, I think Croatian, a Lutheran theologian, influenced by Bonhoeffer and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Very much Lutheran kind of tradition, who then became an Orthodox in the 90s.
This is something that kind of frustrates me about the critique of a lot of these traditionalist types. Not because there isn't a lot that's perverse about a lot of them. I don't want to speak too generally, but because it's very one-sided. So it will be very much a liberal critique of tradition directed towards, lack of a better word, countries determined to have some kind of imperial history. But as soon as you look to anything outside of it, most of these critics are perfectly happy to defend precisely those same attitudes toward tradition in other cultures. And it's like you can critique without being a hypocrite. People for advocating a traditionalist stance at the expense of being cruel to members of their community or members of other communities, but to demonize that as such when you're perfectly willing to sanction it as such in other sectors strikes me as perverse. I don't know if that made sense.
But here's the funny thing. Here's the funny thing. Today, liberals have the position on cruelty. This is the is the kind of, I call it the Rawlsian / Rorty position. The height of justice is avoiding cruelty. But I've always laughed at that. I always, every time I hear them talk about cruelty, the song from Elvis, "Don't be cruel to the heart is true." That's the absurd character of their position, that justice is not being cruel. Now, yes, the avoidance of being cruel is something one should strive for, but it doesn't define justice. No. In fact, justice in itself may require cruelty. You have to be cruel to the right people. You should be cruel. I mean, the question is, what is cruelty mean?
Well, maybe the word cruel is the wrong word. Maybe, you have to be harsh towards certain people. I think cruel is almost by definition unjust.
This issue of the subjectivity of what harshness is. Cruelty is a very subjective concept. Right. Because if anytime harshness is used to you, you feel it's cruel. Okay.
I suppose. I feel like cruelty, it implicates attitude a little bit, doesn't it?
No,
not at all.
Machiavelli's wonderful about this. Machiavelli made a famous line that sometimes being cruel produces a better result end than being pious or loving. And he gives the example of what happened to Epista, where out of concern and care they didn't act as decisively and forcefully as they did, but it ended up prolonging and elongating the conflict and crisis, that it became even worse, and more people ended up.
Yeah.
Whereas if you need to be killed right away.
Yeah.
That's the greatness of the Godfather scene, right? When Michael gets in power and he kills. The baby scene is when the child is getting baptized. At the moment of baptism, all of the needed people needed to be killed.
Yeah,
handful. You didn't have to keep on killing and killing and killing. Being kind means you only don't kill enough. But you end up killing, in the long-term process, end up killing many more people, and no one feels safe. Right. Because Machiavelli says if you're going to be cruel, do it quickly and people will forget about it. But if you're kind and you do it half-heartedly, you kind of poke here and poke there, and you keep on having to poke all the time. Yeah. You're always with the knife, and you're always doing a little bit. And that's the disaster of Americans' Afghan policy.
But I suppose then you would say that that's in fact just a kind of hidden kindness. It's in itself not necessarily cruel.
Liberalism produces a contradiction that we shouldn't be as ruthless as we need to in order to achieve things. And what happens is this leads us to the problem that we therefore can never use force in to achieve results that will actually produce the good result we were looking for, and we end up using force always half-heartedly, and it ends up making things far worse.
Or
Carthage, Rome got peace when it liquidated Carthage. It didn't say, "Oh, Carthage, we're just going to restrain you," and it did that for a while, but it didn't work. So, okay, stop. Final solution. Well, we can't do that because today's final solution is something. If you say that, oh my God, he's a Nazi. No, but come on. This is the idea. This is the problem. Our Christianity and since liberalism is a kind of secularized Christianity, and the liberal understanding of justice is kind of like a kind of soft Christianity of, we should do good and you shouldn't do anything bad kind of thing. That I think this is the problem here, that we can't, and to say these things are so shocking. To say something like,
I think it's even more sinister than that, though, because it's not just that we'll be half-hearted about the force that we need to use and accrue consequences from that. It's that we'll also adopt more and more distanced and irresponsible ways of using the force that we absolutely have to use. So now we have Yeah, exactly.
In other
So
words, the
Obama, who won a
conviction-
Nobel Peace Prize, how many innocent people did he bomb with drones?
Well, but that was not about, I mean, Obama's Peace Prize. I remember the day it happened, and I told my liberal colleague, my American liberal guy, the gay liberal colleague of mine, who's not really that outwardly gay, and he was not really that radical. I mean, I always joke with he's more conservative in his habits than all the non-gay people that champion gay issues. He was. I told him that Obama won the Peace Prize. He goes to me, for what? Okay, it's a guy who voted for Obama.
Why for all of these pieces?
Well, I mean, no. It was a promise that he was going to be different, but he was not going to be different because he was. That's the whole thing. Other issue. Bob.
The joke was I was spelling pieces with an I, but okay.
Well, no, but no. I mean, if we look at, it's the same problem. He did half measures. He made, again, this is the JFK phenomena. Yeah. You talk bigger than you're actually going to deliver. And this is why I like John General Mathis's new book is actually very good and should be read. Bush and Obama, as well as Clinton, always talked big, but chickened out what necessary to do it. In other words, they were quite willing to use force when maybe force shouldn't have been used. But then they weren't willing to use the necessary force to accomplish the end they wanted. Mm. And then would always pull back, just as victory was reachable tactically. They then hesitated and moderated, and that led to that then led to the complete disasters. Everything. I mean, if you're going to intervene in Syria, then you fucking intervene. You do it. You bomb. You say red line. Bomb. Don't just.
Yeah, if you're gonna amputate a limb, you need to amputate the limb, not just slowly whittle away through the skin. It's like, yeah.
Yes. If you're not going to do it, then don't do it, because it's actually worse doing half measures.
Yeah.
Then it would have been better not to do things. Yeah. Like I have always argued that in 1991 there was no need to rescue Kuwait.
Yeah.
But once you rescued Kuwait, you had to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Because if he survived, he was more of a threat to us after. He was a more destabilizing force after surviving 91 than he was before 91.
Well, for God's sake, it's the same thing with the whole thing about Corbyn refusing to say that he would actually return fire in the event of a nuclear exchange. It's like, look, it's really scary to say that you'll exchange nuclear weapons. If you don't, if somebody with nuclear weapons believes that you won't fire back, and they take the opportunity to fire back, like you declaring that you will use nuclear weapons and bathe your enemy's countries in fire if they attack you first, guarantees that won't happen.
Oh yeah, no, but not only that, by him refusing to do this, they know they can use conventional forces without any attempt. In other words, it's not that they don't have. It doesn't give them a use to use nuclear forces. It shows that there's nothing you will pay. You will pay no price. You will do nothing at the most extreme case. That means you will do even less for less important cases. And therefore, it's a kind of like, please do something. I won't stop you kind of symbol.
Yeah.
But that's always a joke with the left. Now you have to finish up, and I think we're going over.
Sorry, this is too interesting. I'm actually going to be late for my point now. But thanks everyone for watching. And Professor Bates does have a channel which I highly recommend. He undersells it. And thank you again, Professor Bates, for joining us. And I hope to have you back again soon. You have a good evening, sir.
Okay. Bye, Bonds.